You know, the most prominent manifestations of Russophobia take place in the Baltic countries. In fact, such segregation approaches were practiced there before by representatives of national minorities and, of course, unfortunately, especially by Russians at this stage. Although historically, in the years of the Second World War, there were terrible persecutions to the level of slaughter, for example, by representatives of other nationalities, Jews. Now, this is not the place in the Baltic countries for Russians, as they consider. And it should be noted that these persecutions are not only not stopped by the leadership of the Baltic countries, on the contrary, they are justified, encouraged, and then stimulated by the authorities. That is, by and large, modern Baltic regimes have made this part of state policy. Artificial restrictions are created for contacts between people. There is, of course, their malicious activity, not only in relation to Russian-speaking citizens within these countries, but they come out, representatives of the Baltic regimes, with anti-Russian initiatives on the grounds of the European Union, NATO, including the issue, for example, of providing military political support to the Kiev regime, which in turn uses this very support again against Russians and Russian speakers. And of course, the most resonant cases of discrimination and biased attitude, and sometimes even harassment of Russian citizens, are recorded in Latvia. The authorities of this country, in fact, since 1922, have begun literally to migratory repressions against Russian citizens, including the implementation of a discriminatory law called immigration, as the most vivid example of this. Although there are a huge number of these examples, it is that in the middle of 1924, a Russian military pensioner, the chairman of the Latvian-Russian Association of Cooperation, Kotkov, who is 82 years old, was expelled from Latvia under an absolutely thought-out pretext, and it was formulated as a threat to national security. This person, a peaceful citizen, a respected figure, was expelled under the pretext that he allegedly inflicts damage and threatens the security of Latvia. There were other expulsions, anti-human actions, and at the beginning of March of this year, the Department of Civil Affairs and Migration of Latvia published the so-called information on the implementation of this Department of Discriminatory Legislation, which stipulates that Latvian Russian citizens living in Latvia should be re-registered by filing an exam in the Latvian language. Well, there was another condition. It was necessary to fill in absolutely Russophobic inquiries, not just discriminatory, but such direct nationalist ones. There were already orders for the departure of citizens who had not passed the procedure for re-registering in Latvia. Some of these prescriptions have been fulfilled, but, of course, these defamatory practices in Latvia for the use of the visa lever or the manipulation of citizenship to expel, as they say, unfavorable Russian citizens, they are also spread to other Baltic countries. In 2024, the authorities of Estonia refused to renew the temporary residence of the Bishop of the Russian Orthodox Church, Metropolitan of Tallinn, and all of Estonia, Evgeny. There were no specific facts. His supposedly hostile, as they put it, activities were, of course, not held. Lithuania lags behind. Since June 2023, there is an updated edition of the Law on Citizenship. So, in accordance with the innovations, citizenship received in the order of exception in the presence of citizenship of another country can be annulled. And why? Because the basis can be a direct threat to national security and support, again, as it is formulated there, of Russia's aggression. Can you imagine that they can confirm everything you want for this? And since November 2023, the authorities of national security of Lithuania have been checking about 800 people who received Lithuanian passports in the order of exception. What follows from this? That several hundred people are at risk. They cannot plan their lives. They cannot dispose of their freedom in full. And Vilnius, Riga, and Tallinn systematically put pressure on the citizens of Russia, including cultural figures who openly express their civic position, who support our country, our people, and the leadership of our country. With the Baltic regimes, a ban is introduced on entry under the absolutely invented, again, fanciful pretext, as they formulate it, of support or participation in the actions of a foreign state, violating the principles and norms of international law. Who would say, but not the Baltic regimes, which have violated the norms of international law in particular, in relation to national minorities for decades, prohibiting people from learning and using their native language, in particular, Russian. What does it mean, prohibiting? Simply creating an environment in which this is impossible, or binding the receiving of the same citizenship with the creation of a language. But this did not become a point for them where they needed to stop. The case does not end with this, and using such a pseudo-legal tool, the Baltic police regimes initiated dozens of fabricated criminal proceedings against our Russian-speaking compatriots, including the citizens of Russia. They hope for local justice, as you understand. They do not have to, because it is completely under the full control of the authorities. And, unfortunately, this justice in the Baltics has become literally punitive. At the same time, their own Baltic and trans-ocean interpretations of international legal norms are used. All this is adapted to the conjunctural political demands of the ruling Russophobic elites. In general, such a hybrid is obtained. And we regularly raise issues of repression against the Russian and Russian-speaking population by the authorities of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, and persecution and restrictions on national identity within the framework of human rights platforms of the United Nations, both in New York and in Geneva. And, of course, at the OSCE platform, we send the appropriate appeals to the relevant monitoring and executive structures, calling on them to assess the illegal actions of the authorities in the Baltics. In particular, we draw attention to the problems of the demolition of Soviet monuments and memorials to the victims of Nazism, deepening of military pensioners, restrictions on the right to study in Russian, which is native to a huge number of residents in the Baltics. We draw attention to the problems of the violation of the right to freedom of religion. We do everything to ensure that international institutions know what is happening with the freedom of speech and its restrictions in the Baltics. To be honest, we are simply destroying this freedom of speech. We documentally confirm the fact of criminal persecution of those who do not agree with this criminal policy of the Baltic regimes. That is, we do not just make a statement, but also give a large factology in the form of documents at the sites of international organizations. Is there a reaction or not to these international structures? There is no proper reaction, but we, so to speak, force them to issue it. They are used to the fact that they can somehow indiscriminately, or send indiscriminate letters, or generally leave all this without an answer. Taking into account the politicized spin in the work of the UN structures and the OSCE, it has become routine. We qualify such a relationship as a factual cover-up of the repressive police regimes of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Nevertheless, we continue, and we will continue, despite the fact that they really do not do their job, and moreover are not yet ashamed of it, but we will still act on this track. The situation with human rights and national minorities in the Baltic states is not even a violation of human rights. but something more serious due to the violation of human rights. All this is regularly reflected in the annual thematic reports of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In the report on violations of the rights of Russian citizens and compatriots in foreign countries, the latter was published in December 2024. In the first joint report of the Foreign Ministry of Russia and Belarus on the situation with human rights in individual countries, it was published in June of last year. Therefore, the work is carried out in a multi-layered, profiled way. Currently, a state program is in effect to provide assistance for the voluntary resettlement of compatriots who live abroad to the Russian Federation. In particular, participants of this state program, foreign citizens or persons without citizenship, can submit documents for obtaining Russian citizenship in a simplified manner. According to the data that we have in the Kosovo departments of the Russian Embassy in Estonia and Lithuania, as of March 25, 2025, 55.2 applications for participation in the state program have been registered. As for Latvia, the reception of citizens is carried out directly in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia in Riga. The order for obtaining Russian citizenship has been regulated by the federal law since 2023 on the citizenship of the Russian Federation. The main condition for admission to Russian citizenship is the residence of a Russian citizen on the territory of our country. Part 1 of Article 15 of the federal law establishes the general requirements in relation to the adults and eligible persons applying for admission to the Russian Federation. Namely, it is permanent residence in Russia with a kind of residence for 5 years. It is the possession of the Russian language. It is the knowledge of the history of Russia and the basis of our country's legislation. In addition, Article 16 of the federal law provides for the favorable order for obtaining Russian citizenship. That is, without compliance with the mentioned requirements, for a number of categories of persons who have moved to live in the Russian Federation. For example, former citizens of the Soviet Union have the right to apply for admission to the Russian Federation if they were born or lived permanently on the territories of the RSFSR or are citizens without citizenship. The state program for providing assistance to voluntary resettlement of our country from compatriots who live abroad is also distributed to compatriots from unfriendly countries. Participants of the state program have the right to obtain citizenship on a simplified procedure after moving to Russia. And it is important to note that Russian migration policy is constantly improving. Since the beginning of the implementation of the mentioned state program, that is, from 2007 to the current year, 1,201,750 of its participants and members of the respective families have moved to our country and are registered in the territorial bodies of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. And in 2024, 31,500 participants moved to Russia, even more than the state program of the members of the families. And according to statistics, most of the migrants are citizens of Central Asian states, but there is a steady trend in the number of applications of representatives of communities living in the territories of the Baltic countries. This is largely due to the vision of the Institute of Repatriation from January 1, 2024, which allows you to choose any region to live in on the territory of our country, with compensation for the expense of moving and the provision of monthly assistance to obtain Russian citizenship and subsequent payment of housing subsidies. According to the Ministry of Internal Affairs of our country, 1,787 people moved to Russia in 2024, which refers to this category of migrants, including countries of the Baltic Trinity, 574 people from Latvia, 111 people from Lithuania, and also 111 people from Estonia. And as the main reasons for moving, the applicants call the deterioration of the social and economic situation in the state of residence, record inflation, high taxes, and special concern. This is very important. They cause Russophobia in the public space and the manifestation of discrimination against the Russian-speaking population at the household level. In addition, the vast majority of migrants do not agree with the imposition of the so-called European values to the detriment of traditional social and family status. To put it simply, their new normality scares them, and they want to maintain the normal normality. And the main points for many of them are reunification with relatives and obtaining education in our country. As the leadership of our country has repeatedly emphasized, Russia is a free country. A person can choose any place of residence. The question is in the behavior of a person in his actions. If these steps, actions have violated the law in Russia, then naturally everyone should be responsible for this, wherever he is in Russia or abroad.